First of all, a very good morning to all of you, and of course to our special guest, Professor Stephen Weatherill. Apologies for the mess up, despite doing this now for 1.5 years. Still, these things happen at times. It is my great pleasure and indeed honor to introduce to you Professor Stephen Weatherill. He is, of course, the Jacques Delors Professor of European Law at the Faculty of Law of the University of Oxford and a professorial fellow, as it is referred to, at the Somerville College of the University of Oxford. And the website I prepared, Stephen, the website states that you work on the constitutional, institutional, and substantive law of the European Union. So basically on anything EU law. Looking at his impressive oeuvre, this is by no means an exaggeration, I would say. Professor Weatherill is writing on general principles of EU law, but also consumer rights and social justice. He's maybe the best known, of course, for his work on all kinds of aspects of EU internal market law and free movement law. And Stephen Weatherill probably knows that he's one of my student academic heroes from the time when I was studying in Berlin. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you here. Professor Weatherill is a sports enthusiast, and in particular football, if I remember correctly from way back. It is thus not very surprising that he has also engaged in what some may consider a niche area of EU law, namely EU sports law. And in his 2017 Principles and Practice in EU Sports Law, published with OUP, I think it can be fairly considered one of the reference works in this field. He's published many other things on this, including, as I found, on European football law. And here's my transition then, right? While, to the best of my knowledge, Hull City was not one of the clubs anticipated to participate, it takes little imagination that Professor Weatherill, both professionally and personally, was intrigued by the announcement lately of April 2021 of, I believe, 12 European football clubs to create a European Super League, a closed league competition rivaling the current Champions League, which included 6 English clubs, I believe, and also a number of Spanish and Italian clubs. Now, these plans were received very controversially, both among fans, I believe, especially in the UK, that was a big thing, but also by the UEFA, who actually threatened to ban these clubs from the European competition. So these plans, but also their rejection by the UEFA, have also raised, of course, interesting legal questions, namely with regard to the compatibility of these plans with EU competition law, but also more general principles of EU law. Consider, for example, the threat by the UEFA of a lifelong ban of the players that participate in such a league to compete for their national teams. So I would say, who better than Professor Stephen Weatherill to tackle this topic and to take us through the maze of the legal issues that I believe come with this European Super League. So without further ado, Professor Weatherill, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this very kind invitation and those remarkably kind words of introduction as well, Fabian. We do indeed go back a long way. So I think you can all hear me. I hope you can all hear me. I'm now going to try and share the screen. Can you see my PowerPoint? Yeah? Good. Right, my topic is then, as Fabian has already introduced, the law and politics of a European Football Super League, what can be done, what should be done. So there's some law here. I think I know about that. There's some politics here. I'm much less confident about that. And also, as Fabian has already revealed, I do have a certain affiliation to one of the clubs that was not invited to join the European Super League, inexplicably so. Hull City were not part of the Dirty Dozen. Now, I hope that my analysis will be in no way influenced by the identity of the club that I support, but in the interests of full transparency, I tell you, I am a supporter of Hull City, and you may choose to tell me that my assessment has been affected by that. Okay. So the Super League that was revealed a couple of weeks ago has been blocked, but the people who proposed it have not gone away, and it's entirely possible that we will see another version of the Super League proposed in the future. So should a Super League be stopped? Well, here I comment as a football fan, not as a lawyer, and my answer is yes. Okay. It seems to me that what I understand to be the character of European football is that our leagues shall be open, that there shall be promotion and relegation, that participation in competitions shall be based exclusively on merit, not on money and not on past tradition. So to me, as a football fan, a Super League should be stopped. But that, of course, might be subject to a different assessment from a different perspective, but that's mine. So a European Super League should be stopped, but who can stop it? Well, states, it's very difficult for states to stop a Super League because the Super League is obviously a transnational activity involving initially under the proposal of the 12 clubs from 3 countries, but potentially from more again. It's pretty difficult for individual states acting unilaterally to take effective action against a transnational practice. There are also legal constitutional questions about what constraints there might anyway be on states insofar as they seek to circumscribe the autonomy of football clubs to choose where they play. So it's not so easy to see that states are likely to be effective at stopping a European Super League. Well, what about UEFA? UEFA is the governing body of European football. It obviously has an interest in preventing a breakaway league, which will not be bound to UEFA. Perhaps most important of all, UEFA's interest in blocking a Super League is both regulatory, in the sense that UEFA wishes to protect the sports model that we're accustomed to in Europe, but also UEFA has a commercial incentive to protect itself against a breakaway league because the big clubs make a lot of money for UEFA under current conditions. So UEFA has a clear incentive to take action against a Super League, the participants in it. The legal question is, what restrictions are there on UEFA and its ability to take action to protect its interests, to deter a breakaway league, a Super League? And the most significant decision of recent times, most factually close to the Super League in football, is the International Skating Union decision, in which the General Court stated as a matter of principle that governing bodies may protect the integrity of the sport. That's a very important recognition that as a matter of European Union law, governing bodies in sport have a legitimate role in protecting the integrity of their sport. The more difficult question is exactly what that means. And we don't get much help from the International Skating Union decision in understanding what it really means, because the International Skating Union case was really rather extreme. The governing body in sport was taking aggressive action against individual athletes in order to prevent the emergence of any possibility of a third-party organizer of events. this really was at the far end of aggressive, vicious action by governing bodies to protect their regulatory and commercial interests. So although the International Skating Union tells us that UEFA, for our purposes, may act to protect the integrity of its sport, it doesn't tell us anything very concrete about exactly how far that goes and what it means. But it's certainly arguable, albeit not covered by any existing practice, that UEFA could take action to deter the creation of closed leagues. UEFA could take action to deter competitions being based on something other than merit as a criterion for participation. That's to say, I think it is perfectly arguable that UEFA, as a matter of EU law, has a right to protect the integrity of European football, which includes taking action to restrain activities which don't follow the traditional model of European football, open leagues, merit-based qualification. As a matter of orthodox EU law, we might identify a legitimate objective, protecting the integrity of the sport. We would then have to go on to consider whether particular measures that are taken to achieve that objective are proportionate. So there's a restriction on UEFA, even if it is permissibly able to act to protect the integrity of European football, on the type of action it can take. And again, it's hard to be confident as to what would be the scope and the limits of UEFA's legitimate action to protect the integrity of the sport. I think it is probably likely that sanctions against clubs and owners would be more likely to be considered proportionate than sanctions on players. I think it's highly probable that the suggestion that clubs and players participating in a Super League could be simply banished forever from participating in UEFA events would go too far, it would be disproportionate. What we also would need to consider when we're thinking about the control which is exercised over UEFA by EU competition law is that on at least some models, the Super League could be seen as pro-competitive. So the Super League could be creating a new competition which would improve or expand the size of the market for sporting competitions in Europe. So it would be really quite difficult to determine in advance where EU competition law draws the line when it comes to assessing sanctions which UEFA may impose. And I'm quite sure that the lawyers advising the Super League told them that UEFA could not go so far as to ban without limit all the clubs and players. I expect on the other side, UEFA's lawyers told them that UEFA would have some legitimate scope to take action against those involved in the Super League. But in the middle, as to exactly just how far UEFA could go, well, it's very unpredictable. And that's part of the problem. European Union competition law exerts control over governing bodies in sport under Article 101, 102, both. But there's no manual which will tell you exactly how EU competition law controls governing bodies. There's no list of what governing bodies can do compatibly with EU competition law and what they can't do. EU competition law applies in an ad hoc manner. It depends on the particular facts at stake, and it's relatively unpredictable, as we can clearly see from the ambiguity of the legal advice that would have been involved in assessing how far UEFA could go in taking action against the Super League. And the truth of it is that that general pattern of ad hoc, unpredictable application is the story of EU sports law generally. You go back to the early days of EU sports law, and we have Raven Koch, and we have Bosman concerning free movement law. More recently, the arena is competition law, Maker Medina on anti-doping, Moto, International Skating Union. European Union law applies to sport in an ad hoc manner. It controls it through particular flashpoints that occasionally generate litigation or commission investigation, whether it's the transfer system or anti-doping. There isn't any clear set of principles which structure European Union law in its application to sport, and the one treaty provision that we have applying EU law to sport, Article 165, is pretty thin and shallow in its explanation of the nature of EU sports law. Nevertheless, if states are not likely to be able to stop the Super League, and if UEFA has limits on its role in stopping the Super League, then the European Union is probably the best place to go to find a body that is likely to be able to take sufficient action to protect the European sports model. The European Union would provide a multilateral place, multilateral environment for rulemaking, which is what is required to address the multilateral transnational character of a Super League. And ultimately, a very pragmatic point is, if the European Union's not going to get involved in dictating what may and may not be done in European sport, then who is? So the issue is whether the European Union is prepared to move beyond a reactive role in sport to a proactive role. So far, EU sports law is all about reaction, applying free movement law and competition law to things that have already happened. The question is whether the European Union should be more proactive. Should it set legislative standards? And this opens up a window on the European Union legislating proactively to protect the European sports model. Perhaps it's only the European football model that we're really worried about. I am nervous about claims to develop a European sports model which are driven by preoccupation with one particular sport. But nevertheless, whether it's a European sports model we're interested in here or a European football model, the question is whether the European Union may legislate for such a beast, which, if it does, will entail putting concrete shape on what the European sports model really means. It entails moving beyond the European sports model as a rhetorical flourish and instead seeking to put legislative shape on its nature and purpose. Well, one obvious issue in legislating for a European sports model would be the shape of competitions. So perhaps the European Union should legislate against closed leagues. Perhaps it should legislate that in European sport it is part of the nature of the cross-border activity that leagues be open, that there be promotion and relegation, and that participation be based exclusively on merit. But if the European Union is going to legislate to define and strengthen the European sports model, I think it shouldn't simply be preoccupied with the shape of competitions. It should be concerned with governance standards as well. One of the slightly peculiar aspects of the story of a couple of weeks ago was that suddenly football fans were looking to UEFA to save them from the breakaway 12. Now, UEFA's a pretty unlikely saviour. The Champions League has been distorted over the years by UEFA's willingness to grant the rich and powerful clubs what they want. Competition has been diminished by the rich getting richer, both in European competitions, where there's a pretty small pool of clubs that can actually win the Champions League, and even more so at national level, where a great many national leagues have become hardly competitive at all because the small number of clubs that make it into European competition get rewards, which lead to the national competition being wholly imbalanced. Now, all that's happened under UEFA's watch. So there's a pretty interesting argument here that the European sports model, if it is to be the subject of protection by the EU, should involve not simply protecting the shape of competitions, but also insisting more aggressively on redistribution of income vertically within the pyramid, so as to promote the healthier competition at European and at national level that has dissipated over recent years because of UEFA's decisions about the shape of competitions. So the push from the EU would be perhaps to create a sports agency, not to replace UEFA, but to push UEFA to become a more truly independent regulator of the game, rather than the regulator which has a very strong commercial interest in increasing the wealth available at the top of the game. Well, will the European Union do any of this? Will the European Union become more proactive? Well, here we're looking at the politics of the matter. I don't have any inside knowledge on this. It's clearly a bigger step for the European Union to move beyond the ad hoc application of competition law by the Commission, and instead to adopt legislation setting standards for the European sports model within the European Union. I don't know whether the member states have an appetite for such a grant of proactive power to the European Union, but I do think that if they don't do it now, they never will. There are also some interesting questions here about what UEFA wants out of this window of opportunity for reform. I'm quite sure that UEFA would welcome EU legislation which protects it from breakaway leagues. I'm much less sure whether UEFA has any interest in the European Union legislating to force it to become more representative of interests other than the big clubs. Does UEFA really want the European Union to legislate for fan representation, for stronger representation for smaller clubs, for more aggressive wealth distribution? Another way of putting that is UEFA really opposed to a closed Super League? Or is UEFA really opposed to a closed Super League which it doesn't control? So there are some interesting questions about the European sports model as something that UEFA might wish to embrace, but also resist. But there is a window of opportunity here to rethink what sporting autonomy means. UEFA has spent many years arguing the virtues of its autonomy from public regulation. What it's now finding is that that may leave it in a precarious position because it, UEFA, wants autonomy from the big rich clubs, and it doesn't have that. So it may be that UEFA has to strike a bargain. It has to surrender some degree of its autonomy from public regulation in order to acquire from the public regulator, most obviously the EU, some protection for it, UEFA's, interests, which are threatened by the big, rich, breakaway clubs. There's already some evidence of UEFA's willingness to see the European Union as friend, not enemy. We know that the transfer system was famously reshaped after the Bosman ruling, partly through informal negotiation between the governing bodies of football and UEFA, and the Commission. And the reform of the transfer system was noted in an exchange of letters between Mario Monti and Sepp Blatter. The legal status of that exchange of letters is very ambiguous. The interesting point was simply the sports federation's interests in working with, not against, the European Union. Rather similar story in the financial fair play area, where UEFA, in crafting its rules restraining spending, was careful to work with the Commission in order to secure informal Commission approval for the financial fair play plans, despite their tinge of anti-competitive implication. And that was recorded in, again, a legally ambiguous exchange of letters or press release by Almunia and Platini. And now we have the threat of the Super League, the which has gone away briefly but will return. Again, the incentive for UEFA is to work with the Commission in order to secure a degree of protection from the big clubs. But I think with UEFA's willingness to work with the Commission to secure protection should also come an insistence that UEFA itself pursue a path of reform in order to be more accountable, more transparent, less in the grip of the rich and powerful clubs who have spent the last couple of decades twisting European football competition away from a competitive model to the model we have now, which is better than the breakaway Super League, but still one heavily imbalanced in favour of the big clubs. So this is a real window of opportunity to rethink the nature of sporting autonomy, and in particular, the relationship between governing bodies in sport on the one hand and the European Union on the other. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Stephen, for this very thought-provoking, and I really mean that, a presentation. And I think UEFA should probably give you a phone call soon. Whether or not you would accept that, I don't know. But so thank you for that. But I now immediately give the word, the floor, the microphone, if you want, to Dr. Markakis Menelaos, who also has organized this, for which I would like to publicly thank you very much. And he is now the man of the hour when it comes to the question and answer session. Menelaos.
Thank you, Professor Amtenbrink, and thank you, Professor Weatherill. Thank you, Steve. That was tremendous, and I'm sure a lot of people will have a lot of things to say or are currently thinking about a lot of things. As a result of your presentation, I will kindly ask whoever wants to make a comment or ask a question to please raise their digital hand, and I will give the floor to them. And if I cannot, I think I can already see Guido. Okay. Guido, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation, for the organization, Menelaos, and for the introduction, Fabian, and thanks to you all for joining us today. Professor Weatherill, when you were talking about legislation EU might adopt, and which deals have to be made, I was thinking about the association model in European sports, where these big clubs are members of the association UEFA, therefore have a vote in the decision-making process according to the statutes and regulations of UEFA itself. And I was wondering in how far, even if the EU would adopt legislation, this association model prevents actually reforms, so that the clubs right now that are part of UEFA as a member would block or try to block any reforms that UEFA would make or try to make following EU legislation or discussions with the Commission.
Maybe Professor Weatherill can answer right away, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think the most important point for me is this is not going to be changed from inside UEFA. The big clubs have secured a powerful grip on UEFA decision-making in a way that is not reflective of the range of interests which are affected by European football, and which is also far from transparent. This is not going to be reformed from within, and even attempts to reform it from without, which means by the European Union, are going to be carefully, strategically and cunningly opposed from within. This is clear. This is a hard nut to crack. This is a pretty powerful cartel And I think that, again, is why my point is it's only the European Union that can do this. States individually can't do this. The Americans can occasionally turn up and put people in handcuffs and march them off. But the problem here, there is a bit of corruption here, but the main problem here isn't corruption. The main problem here is structural. And that needs the European Union to impose reform from outside on UEFA's system of governance.
Thank you, Professor Weatherill. Does anyone else perhaps want to ask a question? So I see someone raise their hand. So if you could please ask your question. I think it's Thomas Peters.
Yes, thank you very much for the very interesting explanation. I'm from the School of Economics, so excuse me if my question is complete legal mumbo jumbo, but I was wondering about another issue. Within the financial fair play proceedings that UEFA has had with Manchester City, for example, the appeal that they eventually won was at the Tribunal for Sports. How do you see, my outsider view is always, why doesn't anybody go to the European Court of Justice or to a normal civil court to challenge these types of regulations if they want? What is your view on the chances of such an appeal when a club would not go to the Tribunal of Sports, but to take this to a civil court?
Yeah, it will happen one day. Okay, that's the bottom line. Sport has been extremely successful in setting up a structure for internal dispute resolution. Yeah, well, the dispute resolution in sport, which culminates in the CAS in Lausanne, is a closed system within which sporting disputes are handled in the family. Yeah, it's the mafia. Okay, we keep it in the family, and you know, like the mafia, it's effective, it's quick, it gets things done. Yeah, people might get hurt along the way, but you know, we're family. Okay, legally, as a matter of contract law, all those involved in the structure of sporting governance have committed to solve their disputes through the arbitral system, which culminates in CAS. And there are only exceptional circumstances in which one can step outside the internal sports dispute resolution system and instead go to the ordinary courts. But one of the set of circumstances in which one may go outside the arbitral process and seek the protection of the ordinary courts is where public policy is at stake, and that certainly covers EU competition law, and it certainly covers EU free movement law as well. So in principle, it would be possible for a dispute of the type you mention to be pursued before the national courts of a state, in addition to or instead of being pursued through the dispute resolution system in sport. There's pretty strong incentives for those involved in the football family not to do that. It'll take a long time. It'll be extremely divisive. And, you know, the big clubs are smart. They've got other ways to protect their interests. But as a matter of principle, there isn't a firm exclusion of sporting practices from review by national courts. And one day when the stakes are big enough, it'll happen.
Thank you very much. Antoine Duval and then Wojciech Lewandowski. Apologies if I mispronounced the name.
Hello everybody. I'm Antoine Duval. I'm a senior researcher at the Asa Institute, and I also work quite a bit on the intersection between EU law and sports. Thank you, Steve, for the presentation. And I would like to make a comment, and maybe going back to the Super League and having the benefit of having you there, Steve, who is probably the person as an EU lawyer that was the first there discussing the intersection between EU law and sports. I want to go back to maybe the responsibility of EU law and indirectly of an interpretation of the application of EU law in sport in that ultimately the decision of those clubs to create the Super League. Because I think what we've been dealing with is with the the intervention of EU law in the domain of sports since Bosman as an intervention that is, let's say, in a caricatural fashion, neoliberal, that facilitates the free economic activity of anybody that is active in sports to the detriment of the sports organizations. And that's what I've been arguing for. I think this is of what EU law is doing in the domain of sports. Going back to what EU law is doing is actually constitutionalizing. So here there is a little interpreting it as intervention to free economic activity rather than as an intervention that aims at making sure that when power is exercised, like they do it by certain principles like proportionality. And if you reinterpret that case law like that, then it becomes also, I think, evident that obviously what you just argued is just that there is room for regulation. That the main purpose of applying to the domain of sport is it's actually checking the power of them, I think, challenging their monopoly on governance or organization.
I don't know if Steve wants to respond right away to that because the connection was not super good and maybe there are any follow-up questions on that. I don't know.
I think I fully understood.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
do you want to respond, Steve?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Antoine. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is why we're at such a potentially dramatic moment. This could be a point at which the nature of EU sports law changes, because, as you say, there has been a kind of neoliberal trend in the previous largely ad hoc application of EU law to sports. And what I'm arguing for here is that UEFA should be the subject of intervention, which makes it be much more transparent, accountable, representative, involved in redistribution from the rich to the less rich, so as to promote more competitive sport within European competitions and in national leagues. So I'm arguing for something which treats UEFA as a body with significant responsibilities to act in the public interests. And I'm arguing that the European Union should legislate for it to be structured like and to behave like a body which carries out a public function. So it's a chance to change the model of governance from the previous practice to something which is more attuned to what I would consider to be UEFA's proper social purpose. But I freely admit I'm making all sorts of normative assumptions there about just how sport should be run in Europe. I'm going far beyond my remit as a lawyer there, and I'm coming back in with my preferences as a whole City supporter.
Thank you, Professor Weatherill. The following person, please, Wojciech Lewandowski.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Also, it's a bit windy and I'm outside, so I hope it will not interrupt the connection. Thank you very much, Mr. Professor, for the presentation. I found it really interesting, especially as I'm pushing my PhD in the scope of limits of autonomy of sports governing bodies that may be imposed by European competition law. And you referred to many thought-provoking issues, but one which I'm really keen to ask you of your opinion is the structural conflict of interest that you mentioned and the remedies that could be imposed on this situation resulting from the competition law. How do you think of the possibility to impose structural remedies such as unbundling of regulatory and commercial functions of sport governing bodies? Would it be possible, as we have precedent in FIA, FIA agreement of European Commission from 1999, and will it be effective at the level of other sport disciplines in Europe?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's an attractive prospect that we need to think about the structure of sports governance, how it is, why it is, and whether it can be better. You look back to the historical development of sports governing bodies, whether it's the IOC or FIFA or UEFA, they all start out as, people acting genuinely for the good of the game. It's the gentleman amateur. It's about putting some kind of order on sport. A long time before there was any commercial significance. And over time, governing bodies have acquired commercially sensitive functions because sport itself has become more commercially relevant. So we've got a kind of historically driven pattern whereby governing bodies are regulatory bodies and commercially significant actors as well, without it ever having been thought through as to how those roles should interact, if at all. And so we get the ad hoc decisions of the Court of Justice and of the Commission, which reflect that historical peculiarity, that historical incremental drift. The International Skating Union is just the latest example of the conflict of interest that arises where a governing body in sport performs regulatory functions which also have commercial implications for its own profits. Now, is it time to sit down and say, well, we're in a time of enormous commercialization of sport, and we need to establish governing bodies as independent regulators protecting the integrity of the sport, as the General Court has accepted in the ISU decision. But we also need to separate out the commercial functions of governing bodies so that the regulatory side and the commercial side do not infect each other. Again, I'm very attracted by that, but it's got to be done from outside. And I think it can only be done by legislative intervention, not by the ad hoc application of competition law. And I think it can only be done by the European Union. That's the agenda we face.
Thank you, Professor Weatherill. I see there is a question by our good colleague, Florin Coman-Kuhn. Florin, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and well, thank you very much, Professor Stephen Weatherill, for this wonderful and exciting presentation. I think indeed very much thought-provoking. And yeah, my question would go really, on leaving aside the political side of the story and all these kind of conflicts of interest and etc. My question would go basically from a pure black letter law legal perspective. So then basically, while I very much agree with this kind of desirability of the European Union to legislate over European Union sports model, I very much agree with that. I was just wondering, since you argue for the possibility of adopting specific EU legislation on this issue, I was wondering specifically, what do you think would be, the potential legal basis for such EU legislation? And in this respect, I'm just, thinking of Article 60 FU, where basically we have, a bit. Article 6 basically seems to say that, well, EU only has very light supporting, let's say, competences when it comes to sports and this kind of matter. So then, in this respect, just as a concrete black letter lawyer, I would be curious to hear your thoughts on the possible legal basis for such, forward-looking and revolutionary EU legislation on a EU sports model. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. People often say to me, Steve, you're so boring. You always talk about competence. And I thought that today, for the first time, I did not talk about competence. So thank you for inviting me to talk about competence. My suggestion would be that the provision of football in Europe involves the cross-border provision of services, and therefore harmonized rules could be adopted by the European Union, which would inter alia define the context of the competitions and the governance standards that must be met by those who supply those services. So it would be a straightforward harmonization legal base, and you, as you know, can do almost anything pursuant to harmonization.
I can readily confirm that Professor Weatherill loves talking about competencies. There's no doubt about that. Jan, do you want to ask your question, please?
Yeah. Hi there. Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot, Steve. This was brilliant, as always. Really enjoyed it. I have a short question about the impact of fans and fan culture in this respect. We saw the video footage from Manchester 2 days ago. And I was curious about what you thought, how this would affect what you're proposing and what other people have proposed. I mean, it's not that it's the first time that we see fans becoming active about football and football governance, but I think in recent history, this is really quite extraordinary that we see the protests, especially here in the UK, on the streets, in front of stadiums, on the stadiums as of Sunday. Yeah, I'm curious to hear what you think. Is this maybe a factor that needs to be taken into consideration? Might you see a reason, an incentive for UEFA to actually do what it has not done in the past, to self-regulate? Might it make it more likely that national governments intervene? I mean, the British government here has been very keen, at least for now, in its kind of stating its intentions to do something about it. Within the commission, we saw this weird infight of Margaret Vestager really not wanting to get involved, but her colleague, Commissioner Sinas, who's what's his job title, the protection of the European way of life. He was very active on Twitter and giving interviews saying that we really should do something about it. So yeah, just curious to hear what you think the fan factor, the role of the supporters here will be.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. I'm not sure I have anything really, certainly have nothing insightful to say, but I kind of had two feelings as I watched the fan protest. One feeling was a really positive feeling, that I was seeing fans who cared enough about the game to get on the streets, to protest. Supporters of the Dirty Dozen were very powerfully opposed to what was being proposed. I felt really encouraged by that. Their commitment was to the sport, not to their individual club, and certainly not to the owners of that club. On the other side, much more negative, I thought that the owners of Manchester United and the owners of Chelsea and the owners of Arsenal were watching these protests and laughing, thinking to themselves, look, we've got more fans of the English Premier League in China than there are in England. And you guys can protest all you like outside the stadiums, but you won't be protesting when your home games are played in Beijing, will you? So I sort of felt a little worried that football's already lost.
Thank you, Steve. Are there more questions, perhaps? Otherwise, I would briefly like to ask my own couple of questions, if that is okay, Steve. So obviously, I'm not an expert on this, so you've been warned. The first question I would please like to ask you has to do with the International Skating Union case. And I don't know to what extent this is accurate or not, but at least the perception among some people was that a decision of this kind almost emboldened those 12 teams to move forward with their plan for a European Super League. I know that there's still an appeal pending before the Court of Justice. I have no idea what the Court of Justice will say, but I just wanted you briefly to offer your thoughts on the International Skating Union and maybe a prediction as to how it will play out in the Court of Justice. And my second very quick question is, I would like to ask you rather provocatively, I mean, I know you referred to the role of the state in the beginning of your talk. Is this the very first case of a Brexit dividend? Because the perception among some fans is that the UK government would have been able to take action, or at least threaten of taking action, that would not have been possible within the confines of the EU. And I wanted to ask you to what extent you think this is an accurate assessment or not. Thank you.
Yeah, on International Skating Union, I was just reading the appeal this morning, actually, and the appeal is based on the claim that the General Court's ruling is contradictory and doesn't address all the issues raised. It's sometimes hard to know, but I didn't see anything in the General Court's decision that looked problematic to me. And the Commission decision in the first place was very fully reasoned. So I wouldn't expect the appeal to change anything. And even if there was some point of detail that that was adjusted by the Court of Justice, I still think the General Court's acceptance that there is an integrity to the sport which a governing body can defend will live on. Brexit dividend? No, I don't think so. I don't think that there is anything obvious that the UK government can do now that it could not have done previously. I also think that the UK government, most of all the British Prime Minister, were very good to say, ho, we'll do something here, but they didn't actually do anything. And the current British government is very good at playing the fool and getting crowd noise in support of playing the fool, but not actually doing anything that is of concrete value. So no to any Brexit dividend.
Thank you so much for your answers. Maybe we don't keep the latter part of your answer on the recording. We'll consult with Professor Amtenbrink on that. If there are no further questions or comments, I give the floor back to Professor Amtenbrink to close the session.
Well, thank you very much. I was just wondering one more thing, Steve, and you may feel you have talked about this or not, but of course we also have quite a few students joining us, and you were talking a little bit about the relevance of EU competition law, but I was wondering whether you could maybe also still say a couple of things about more generally the application of EU internal market law, and to what extent you see in the kind of plans as they were envisaged, you see how internal market law could come into this or not.
But I think or not really. I mean, I think part of the problem was that when you saw the plans for the Super League and you thought they should be stopped, it's difficult to find obvious legal instruments with which to stop it. Internal market law is mostly reactive. It's mostly about deciding what may not be done rather than what shall be done. And it's not easy to find obvious basis on which to say that the Super League is impermissible. Rather the reverse, the Super League was probably in quite a strong legal position. And perhaps it should be, it's injecting competition on some models. But no, I think what we're exposing here is a deficiency in European Union internal market law. Sport does ask some specific questions which probably need a more interventionist role than the EU has traditionally played.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I mean, maybe not so much internal market law, but I was also some stage kind of like thinking about EU fundamental rights, the moment that UEFA, which is a separate point, UEFA was threatening, that players would be banned for life or not, from basically, possibly exercising fundamental rights, from working. So you think there's anything in that?
Yes, probably. It may not necessarily add anything to what competition law would already provide, but certainly arguments rooted in the Charter would at least support and possibly strengthen the arguments based on competition law as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This is your last chance, dear participants. Anybody wants to come in? If not, I obviously like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Weatherill, Steve, to thank you once more for this very timely and thought-provoking lecture, especially this part on proactive and not stopping being reactive. While you were referring to the skating union case and the general court's approach to that bodies may protect the integrity of the sport, I was thinking that maybe there should also be an obligation on clubs to protect the love for the game, for their fans, because I think that's that doesn't really seem to be at the center of what do you call them? The Dirty Dozen. I will not forget that so quickly. The Dirty Dozen was doing. So with that, thank you very much indeed once more for this super tight masterclass on the legal issues and also political issues involved. And I would also like to thank once again Dr. Markakis, Menelaos for organizing it, and all the participants for being here, for asking informed questions, and for hanging in there while we were trying to solve the technical difficulties. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you from me as well. I'm very pleased that we managed to get past the technical obstacles. That was a very interesting discussion, so thank you.
Might I ask one last thing?
Go on.
Could we ask you to maybe come back and present to us at the Erasmus Union once again later on?
In person?
No, we would love to, but if not in Zoom, but most wantingly in person, could we do that?
It would be wonderful.
Awesome.
We have a wonderful football club here. Actually, we have two in the city, Steve. So
Go anywhere for some football, especially today.
Thank you very much indeed, everybody.
Thank you.